think everyone's out of the rooms. Oh, right. Okay, I think we're good to go. So hello everyone, my name is Alex Antonison and I run Nashville Data Nerds. Thank you for everyone for joining us for the kind of our first kickoff of 2021. I'd like to say thank you to Matt for taking the time to talk with us about his journey into data and some interesting things he has done with his art background, I think art degree. A couple of things. Data nerds, you know, my core thing about data nerds is I like it to be a conversation, but as we all know on Zoom, it's hard to have a conversation. So the way I like to run this is if you have any questions or comments, please post them to the chat. I will keep a close eye on the chat and will gently bump Matt when there's an opportune time and we can kind of try and facilitate that conversation. Without further ado, Matt, I'm going to kick it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Alex. And thank you everyone for being here. I appreciate you giving me a chance to share my story, and it's nice to meet some of you. I hope we'll continue to network and stuff. I'm on LinkedIn and GitHub. I'll share the link at the end of this. We should definitely link up at the end. But if you'll just forgive me for 1 second here. I'm very excited to be presenting today. Give me 1 second. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So my name is Matt Barnes, as Alex just said. And so for my presentation, I'm new to the data analytics field, new to data. And part of this journey for me has been figuring out how I'm going to leverage my background, a non-technical background in the world of data analytics. And I thought this would be a good talking point for a lot of people, for people who are already in the field and for people who might not yet be in the field. And so I just wanted to kind of go over some of the things that I've found useful from my creative degree. The first thing I really wanted to focus on was sort of challenging the cliche of, you know, it has to be the most cliche the most cliche thing is like, what are you going to do with your art degree? It's like, you know, it seems like the least useful thing you can study in school and spend, you know, $40,000 or however much in debt. And so I wanted to kind of approach that and look at this through my experience learning data analytics and working with data. And a few of the major ones that I'm going to be going over today are through examples of some of the work I've done is creative problem solving, like thinking outside the box, perspective. When I say that, I mean just like being able to zoom in and zoom out of a project and really kind of, you know, get very detailed, but also be able to step back to get the bigger picture and to get the project finished. And then lastly, crafting a narrative, which is a major part of what was a major part of my training as an artist. I love to make illustration, but also as a data analyst. So just as a sidebar, this is just a recent piece of a digital drawing I made for a friend's band. It was for Halloween. You know, a lot of the bands will do like a cover of a, you know, they'll do covers of a specific musicians, Nirvana and stuff, whatever. They were doing like a 2001 Odyssey theme. So just a little taste of some of my art. I don't want to go too far into that, but this is me. These are the core tenets of my being. I'm a father, husband, artist and California transplant. I moved here about 4 years ago to Nashville, for those of you who might not be from the area. And being an artist has always been an important part of my being. It's always been a self-esteem booster. It's just part of my identity. It's always what I thought made me cool, as you know, as I've been growing up, and being able to express myself has always been important. So hence why I went to college for it and into a lot of debt. but I earned my Bachelor of Fine Art from Sonoma State University. And just, you know, I didn't really have a career in mind. I just knew I wanted to use my hands. I knew I wanted to explore that part of my brain and be creative. And so that's what ultimately drove me to do that. And throughout my life, I've been looking for a career to, satisfy my creative drive, my attention to detail, my ability to communicate, and a love for things that are beautiful, and presenting those things to people. So, you know, you might be wondering, like, well, what inspired the change to data analytics? Like, what's, you know, where's the romance? Well, I mean, ultimately, it was my son. This is him at 1 year old, Owen. He's now 3. But I wanted to provide for my family, and I wanted to learn something that was more more practical, but also had a little bit of. I'll try to check this chat occasionally. I'll pull it up right here. Yeah, isn't he? Yeah, just look at those cheeks. He has his mother's cheeks for sure. And I wanted, you know, I wanted to do something that was practical, but also sort of using that creative side of my brain. A data engineering or software engineering friend of mine told me about SQL, and just how if you know it, you can, you know, there's a lot of opportunity for you. So I started self-studying it, but I needed that structure. So I signed up for the Nashville Software School Data Analytics Jumpstart, just to make sure that it was the right thing, because I didn't want to spend a bunch of money on a boot camp that before I knew that I really wanted to do it. And by a bunch of money, it really wasn't that bad compared to what I spent in college. So, and this just had me falling in love with the process of working with data, and just looking at, you know, making something out of nothing, and telling that story, especially the narrative, was always a big thing for me. So I signed up for the boot camp at Nashville Software School, and I graduated just this past June. Half of the semester was in the pandemic. Sorry, my slide's not changing for some reason. So I graduated from Nashville Software School, and here I am currently looking for a role in data analytics. But that's enough about me. Without further ado, I wanted to dive into some of the things that I think that have helped me, and that my creative degree and my creative training have helped me, and maybe they can help you. Things that you could focus on in the future, in terms of just like how to even make your toolkit even better. And the first one will be creative problem solving. And this is crucial for an artist. I mean, you're having to, first of all, create something out of nothing most of the time. At least for me, as more of like an illustrator, I would be using, conjuring up images out of my own head to sort of say the message that I wanted to say. So this really informs me as a data analyst. And so looking at the first case study, it was, as I mentioned before, Nashville Software School Jumpstart program. And it was so much fun. I had such a great time. Now you might be wondering, why am I looking at Guy Fieri right now? Well, I'm not sure how he wound up on our cover slide as our group project, but he's there and we just got to deal with it. This project was kind of what really motivated me to keep going in data analytics and really have a go at it. And this project was at the end of a 3-week period of the Jumpstart program, where, and some of you might be familiar who have been in the program, we were looking at Metro Nashville police data using Python. And granted, I had a little bit of computer experience, but Python was like a brand new world. So I had a lot to learn. But so a lot of this data set, as you can imagine, this is police call data. So most calls are ascribed a disposition. So there, a robbery is taking place. Anything that you can imagine, traffic violations and such. They're called 10 code descriptions, essentially just talking about the nature of the call. It was chock full of things that are just so charged and serious, and things that were just like, this data set is just so, this is the world, this is what's going on. Just as a kind of a side note, working with this data was also very special to me because it was so close to where this new city that I was exploring and living in and learning about. So this was like very special in that way too. But so I'm looking through these 10 code descriptions, and we're trying to, hardest part about group projects sometimes is just starting and hearing each other out and, spitballing ideas and stuff. And so I threw out the idea. I was like, I know, what about meal break? What's a meal break? It's like right above fight and assault or like vehicle accident, shots fired. Like, okay, let's take a look at that. And that was interesting to me because I feel like a lot of people looking at this data set might have overlooked that because it has such a serious overtone, and it should, of course. But this is just a chance to sort of breathe some life and narrative into the data. So I proposed the idea, the group loved it, and we ran with it. And it wasn't just a way for me to be clever. It's like I really wanted to just, look at it in a way that was different from, maybe what the other groups were doing. And so we decided to put the spin of every row of data in that data set had a geographic location tied to it. So we broke it down by unit, which is essentially just a specific car or specific officer. And we started to determine from those geographic locations, well, what kind of food might the officer be interested in? Just sort of based off of like a Google search that was showing nearby restaurants. And of course, some preferred a little more variety or, and such, but then some others preferred more like fast food, maybe of course, this is just like a donut joke. Yeah. This is just like kind of like fantasizing about it a little bit. Of course, there might be some technical things about these otherwise like useless points of data, but I thought it was fun and my group loved it. And it turned out like we had so much fun presenting it. I could tell like all of our group members were having a great time. And the biggest part was when I was talking to the head of Nashville Software School, one of the heads, and they told me that it was of that class, it was their favorite presentation. So I was feeling pretty good at that point, and I hope my group felt good too. But I think the kind of the big lesson here is just taking an otherwise like serious data set and finding that extra angle, that new, that different kind of unique thing about it that, that you might not think of right off the bat. So the second thing that was, this is the second project I wanted to talk about, and this is mainly talking about, being detail oriented and how art sort of, you hone in on the details, you hone in on, the painting of the master painting, what's finding the meaning in it all. And when you're drawing, you're sitting there, you're so close to the page, you're focused on that. I feel like the same thing happens with data. You start zooming in so much on each row, and you kind of mistake the forest for the trees, if that's the saying. I forget. But this case study for me is a good example of like getting lost in the details, but then being able to sort of step back out of it, and make something happen. So as you saw, it was an assessment for a Shurion, an Excel assessment. This was kind of my first successful go around with interviews. I'd never really made it to the past, like, to an assessment point up to this point. Just a basic overview. They were launching a pay per experience model. So it's just in the way that they pay their employees who are offering tech support to their customers, hourly versus pay per experience, like kind of like a ride sharing service kind of thing. And basically my job was to look at how it was doing. And, this is my biggest takeaway from this is like, be detailed, but don't forget to take a step back. It's just like a piece of art. Like, you can't focus on it and just focus on the details. Like, being able to step back and look at the bigger picture and sort of see where your shortcomings are. And I feel like this was something I had to learn, like trial by fire kind of thing, learning it on the go. And I think it took away from my experience with it. But I did get into the final round, was not hired, sadly. But I did get some cool feedback in that he said that the hiring manager was sharing my dashboard with some of his other colleagues, which would put a feather in my cap. And I think one of the other things about this is, like, as you can see, this was made in Excel. Use limitations, especially when you're being creative. Limitations are your friend. They shouldn't hinder you. They should force you to think outside the box, like we were talking about earlier. And Excel is kind of a notoriously boxy, plain program, but I feel like with a little tweaking, you can make these things look and feel like they don't belong in Excel, of course. But again, use limitations to your advantage, especially when being creative. But and so the third case story is very important to me. As I mentioned earlier, as an illustrator, narrative is important. And in my eyes, all data tells a story. It has a life. It means something. It's a record. It's really beautiful, really. But I've found that it's just, there's so much to be gleaned from looking at these lines of text and numbers, and creating a story of it is the best part. So this is for my capstone project. This was at the end of my boot camp. And I chose it's kind of a cheaty subject, because baseball, Major League Baseball, has so much history and so much story and lore and everything about it. So I kind of got off easy in terms of narrative. But this project was inspired by my father-in-law. He's 94. He lives with us. We've been at home with COVID and everything, but not with COVID, but to stay away from it. But he's amazing. He's just unlike anybody you've ever met. He's from Brooklyn. He grew up during the Great Depression. He saw Jackie Robinson play his historic first game in the major leagues, and holding this book on the left, the score book, is actually his. That's his handwriting on the front. Rex Barney. He was a pitcher. Believe this is a game he threw like a shutout or a no hitter or something. I'll try not to bore you with baseball lingo, but holding this book in my hands was, this is statistics. This is data right here. Like, I just had this otherworldly kind of connection to this data, that I was working with, that my project was about. And so I decided to choose this for my capstone project and see what I could find out about the data. And of course, this was at the end of the boot camp, which was 6 months long. And our project is kind of like a thesis kind of thing. We had to, had to be approved by the faculty, and then of course, like, presented at the end of this to potential employers or community. I presented it to all kinds of people because I was just so happy to share the story. So one of the things is, we can talk about here is like being okay with, being flexible when you're starting out, when you're asking questions about data, and when you're creating that narrative. Ask the wrong questions. Go to those dead ends, because you won't, how else are you supposed to know if you save it until the last minute? I started off with this project wanting to compare, talk about whether some of the star players throughout history would have had an impact on attendance numbers for that specific team. This was all in Power BI and some Python, some SQL. But I started off with questions that I couldn't really quantify. It was just too subjective. It was too, that I couldn't, there was no concrete data to back it up, really. It was just kind of a fun exploration, but I had to do it. So I had to pivot, and this is all happening before I was even approved, really, for this project. So I started looking at the data set kind of backed up a little bit, not by team, but by the entire league. And I started to see that these numbers were more influenced by things that were happening around the world. And that was much more interesting. That was more concrete. This graph here just shows from 1900 to 1950. And you can see in the years where these major things were happening around the world, the 1918 flu pandemic, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, those kinds of things have a noticeable impact on the game and how many people are coming into the seats. So, as I mentioned before, my argument became more concrete just by the sheer fact of having that companion data. But then, thinking about the 1918 pandemic, we're in a pandemic right now, and then that was also playing into this. Is like it turned into it transformed into another story that we could talk about, and that was the future. Splat, like the attendance for baseball is, I don't know if anybody was in the stands for this season that they cobbled together, but that's going to change the face of this data, the face of this graph forever. It's not going to be, it will be as low as it was when it first started. It's just like, where do we go from here? It'll be the sharpest decline. And I should mention too, that baseball has had this meteoric rise of attendance until about 2007. You can see there the peak of attendance was about 2007, and has been on the decline ever since. And many sports people will discuss what is the future of this sport. Less and less people are going. More and more people are, it's competing with other kinds of media. There's not really a need to be here. And now that there's this virus that it just changed the entire game. So that really had me thinking like, okay, well, where else can I take this? I wanted to see what I could do in terms of what a socially distant baseball game might look like, so that we could get people back in the stands to enjoy the game. That was, to me, that was like the only thing I could offer in terms of an insight that I thought would be um, helpful for this situation. So this is my team, San Francisco Giants. It was AT&T Park. I don't know what it is now. But essentially I went through and with each of these sections determined approximate numbers of how many seats are in each section. Just some basic maths later. Did a little fun exercise of just like spacing out the seats, sort of rough spacing of like how far apart the seats would need to be with a little Pythagorean theorem. Of course, like a standard sort of stadium seating, configuration. Just as kind of a fun exercise, and also I got to use my Adobe Illustrator skills too. So that was bringing that creativity back. But so with that being said, remember, like, you are, we're all creative beings, and like you have it in you to be creative. And I feel like it can really help you when you're feeling stuck to sort of kick those things into gear, problem solving in a creative manner, thinking outside the box, stepping away from your work and considering the bigger picture. And then I think last but not least is to create the stories of this data that we are kind of in charge of, that we're talking about, that we're telling stories about. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alex, and everybody for being here. This is from this photo is from this is Owen eating his birthday cake. It was his actual birthday that week, but he I think he must have had like 3 or 4 different types of cake for different celebrations and stuff. But anyway, thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. Does anyone have any? Oh, whose eyes does he have?
Definitely my wife's eyes. Most of my family are brown-eyed peeps, so my wife has like blue-green.
Matt, I do have a question about like some of your analysis, and I know I'm probably chiming in when other people want to, so I'll make it quick. Like, one of the things I thought was really interesting that you brought up is that you were talking about, okay, here are the trends based upon like attendance, et cetera, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how like economy has impacted, attendance to these certain games, specifically with the Giants. I'm sure you've thought about this, and I don't know if it's like in the wheelhouse or outside of the wheelhouse, but I'm a baseball fan too, so this is why I bring it up. Have you ever thought about, or has anyone ever thought about, or I don't even know if it's possible to compare, like if we had certain players that, were most memorable, like how would that look in terms of today if we had them in the stadium in terms of attendance, even with COVID or those other additional factors? And again,
Right.
that like way outside of like left field. I don't know, but hence why I'm asking. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, because that's kind of where my thought was initially, was to explore. I noticed that there were big spikes in specific years that these players came onto these teams. Barry Bonds for the Giants is like the home run record, etc. And I plugged it in, and well, it did kind of support that theory, but when I started looking at other teams, like I started looking at Babe Ruth when he was signed, or Ken Griffey Jr., there just wasn't enough for me to truly, to really have that concrete sort of data backing up those claims. I think it would be a fun one to sort of go into more detail, but at this point I had to just back off because it was just, I had so much to do.
Oh, I bet. No, and that's a great point. Knowing when, like, hey, I need to take a step back, I'm done, and I can always reapproach this later, but I've come to a conclusion, or what was the question I was trying to solve. So awesome point. And like everyone else said, great presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody coming and hearing me out.
Anyone else have a question? Feel free to unmute and ask away.
Not a question, but working off of what Julie's saying, I wonder if there's a correlation between attendance for games that are played with like a certain number of future Hall of Famers. So obviously you wouldn't be able to look at it now, but you could say, starting 20 years and older, find the total number of future Hall of Famers in each game played and see if there's correlation with that and the attendance. Hall of Famers aren't always the flashiest players, right? So, there might not be a correlation, but it's just interesting line of thought.
That's a great idea. I love having that, I feel like that's why it's great to work on a team too, because you can really explore all of your available avenues and really make the project the best that it could be. And that, you might be able to actually quantify that really. I mean, there's so many statistics that have been kept about baseball. It's just, it has to be one of the most recorded sports ever, or well, in American history anyway. So yeah, I think that's such a cool idea. And I've yet to watch Moneyball, but
Oh man, Moneyball is one of my favorite movies, even though to anyone that knows me, I'm not a huge sports person, but I do love statistics. So one area I'm curious if you thought through this and what your thoughts are is, you brought up that there's a lot of different media sources that are contending for people's attention. And you're seeing a decline in in-person baseball attendance. Have you considered looking at, this is really hard to quantify, but like, are people viewing it via other mediums? Are they like watching it via some sort of like cable or streaming, and seeing like, is there like a negative correlation between people no longer attending, but also maybe more people are just watching, on TV?
yeah, that would be another great avenue to explore. I'm not sure like what data is available. I feel like that's what seems like can be one of the biggest stumbling blocks when you're thinking of these kinds of projects. But like, if the data is out there, I honestly haven't looked, but I think that would be amazing, especially because people are talking about this. There's actual concern about the future of the sport in terms of that, filling the seats, and people, as a baseball fan myself, like, I enjoy going to the game. It has its own special meaning to it, versus watching it at home. So, it'll be interesting to see how many of those people who are kind of grandfathered into watching the game in person. But yeah, like there's no doubt that Julie says there's, as long as cold beer is involved. Yeah. Amen. Yeah. So yeah, I think that would be a great way to explore it, is to see if there's anything else out there. One thing I wanted to do was kind of bring in GDP, and see how that, for America anyway, like see the GDP and how that affects, like if it in fact follows those attendance lines.
I wonder how that'd be affected too with the cost of average tickets, right? The inflation of tickets over time compared to, I don't know, median household take home of that year or something like that.
Right.
Right. Has that gap, was it more or less accessible, financially to go to a game in the past? So that would be, yeah. Sure, there's lots of factors. That's the thing about data. You start digging and then it's like, okay, next question.
And I've heard too that, I mean, it'll, like, at least not from the league directly, but that the in-person games will be more catered toward sort of having that sort of luxury experience, kind of, or something like maybe so it might be less accessible, like from what I can tell, if they're charging more for less, they're not going to fill the house, they're going to charge more. That seems like it'll be less accessible.
Is that in response to the declining attendance, do you think?
It's hard to tell for me. The data set that I was looking at, 2007, is, like I was saying, was the highest recorded attendance for the entire league. So it's hard to tell, but since then, I mean, it's dropped like 10 or 20 million, I want to say. And it's just kind of on a pretty steep decline already before COVID. So I'm sure like they're realizing that they have to do something about it.
Hey, Chip, go ahead. Your audio, I don't think is coming through.
Sorry, I had it muted manually. So my background is actually fairly similar to you. I have a fine art degree that I'm trying to kind of leverage within the data field. I'm currently going through the data analytics full-time boot camp. Julie actually came and talked to us today. But what are some things that you were able to identify from your background that gave you a leg up over other people while looking for a job? And did you look for a job in a more creative field? I know personally, I'm looking at banks and financial institutions, which are notably boring in that sense. So what's your take on all that?
Well, as I was talking about this a little bit earlier, but having that creative background, it's been hard for me to plug it into this tech field, like it's so alien, or at least on the surface. And I'll be honest, like I'm still looking for a job. Like I'm not currently employed. But using those experiences that you do have, and when it's not related, looking at the things that they do want to see, like collaboration, all those things that you would think of when you're like writing your resume, that people tell you to emphasize in your experience, anything that they can use. In terms of like looking into a creative field, I haven't really bothered with it. I've just been open to anything data, mainly because I feel like those are just the tools that I have in my toolkit now, and that like I'm kind of open to whatever. Like data is the new kind of medium for me. It's not as like I'll always draw and I'll always build things, and but healthcare, sure. Like the more complicated and weird and like interconnected, like the better, because it's just like a big puzzle to solve, but I forget, sorry, I get so excited at these things and I kind of trail off. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, I feel a lot of the same sentiment that you feel, just kind of like when I finish the boot camp, it's just like anything related to data, I'm ready to take it and run with it. And then, as the job goes along, just kind of find where I can, use that creative element from my background to just enhance presentations or, any sort of like natural workflow between programs and stuff. So.
Oh yeah. And communicating, I mean, it's crucial to any, it's so important. And, if you're an artist, I feel like, or a creative type, and you're conveying those kinds of messages in your work, you have a leg up because you can think of complicated things and distill it down into something that can be displayed individually or easily digestible,
Totally.
I had a question sort of for the group. Is that okay, Alexander?
Go for it.
Okay. So I don't know how many people are actually in like a data science role, but I guess as someone looking to break into the industry, how would you kind of rate the relative importance of visualization versus like knowing about all the machine learning algorithms? Like, or do you have an example of where that was the critical piece, like being able to communicate something visually was really valuable? Like, how much should I focus on building that skill set compared to other more kind of technical aspects?
So I'm happy to jump in. In fact, I'm going to share something. This is so I love talking about data and different roles in data. So data science and data analytics share that kind of concept of you're exploring data, you're doing data visualizations with data. You just approach it slightly differently. On a data analyst side, you're trying to describe data. On the data science side, you're trying to describe you use visualization to tell a story about the models you have created, which in a business type setting, that's key. It's fun and it's fun to make models, but at the end of the day, we're all being paid to solve problems for organizations. So model interpretability is a huge deal. I would say focusing on data visualization to kind of support that is important. And understanding how to you built this model and how to explain it, that's going to be very impactful versus knowing the inner workings of XGBoost, CatBoost, deep learning, neural networks. Like these are all things that you should be aware of and understand the problems they solve. Like you should understand the situation. Like, okay, I'm doing image processing. I'm going to start off with, convolutional neural network. So it's good to have like a high level understanding of each of the algorithms and how you would approach maybe using them and solving a problem. But just in line with that, you need to be able to explain the results of that. And that's where having a good foundation using data visualization, on the Python side, you have Matplotlib and Seaborn. On the R side, you have, ggplot. And across both is Plotly, which I'm a huge fan of. So it's, and really from that perspective, I'd say it's about explainability, not as much like, you're not thinking about it from the perspective of like business intelligence. You're thinking about it from, I've built this model. How do I use that to kind of explain the outcomes of it?
Thanks.
Of course. Well, everyone, thank you for coming out. Thank you, Matt, for taking the time to speak with all of us. We have hit time. So I will be putting together a group of links of the presentation, any code, and the recording. I should be getting that out. Usually I do it within the few days after the meetup. So awesome. Thank you everyone for coming. Hope you all have a good night.